let's finish up this skirt construction. Make sure you've got your stay stitching in your waistline. I'm going to open up my zipper. You should have stay stitching from your side seam to center back, side seam to center back, and again from side seam to center front, and side seam to center front. Make sure you've got a row of stay stitching. Should be at 3/8 of an inch from your raw edge, so it's inside of your seam allowance. And make sure you've opened up your zipper so you can work with your waistband in the round. I'm going to put my skirt right side up with the front. Remember, the front does not have a zipper in it. Front of my skirt facing up. I'm going to get my waistband. At the center front, if you were following the videos, there should be a set of 3 notches at your center front. There's one. I have a second one just there, and a third one here. So there should be a set of 3 notches near the center of your skirt. If you only have 2 notches about an inch apart, remember to fold those together, matching up the notches, and then clip along that fold so you can get a notch right in the center of them. So there should be 3 notches there on the front of your skirt. You should have a set of corresponding notches along your waistband. They will only exist on one of the long edges of your waistband. So if you're feeling along the edge of your waistband and you're not seeing a set of 3 notches, that edge does not go to this particular seam. It will eventually, just not yet. But I do have my triple set of notches right here. So those are my 3 notches here, corresponding to my 3 notches at my center of my skirt. So I've got my skirt face up. Here's the center of my skirt. My 3 notches are sitting right along here. And here are the 3 notches for my waistband. Notice that my waistband is wrong side up. I want to put right sides together. So I'm going to line up these 3 notches. Again, with wrong sides together. Wrong side of my skirt up. I'm sorry, right side of my skirt is up. Right side of my waistband is down. So right sides together. Matching up those 3 notches. And I'll start pinning that into place. All right, so that is lined up. Make sure to keep the raw edges flush. We want the raw edges at the same level of your skirt and your waistband. And I'm gonna work this way. Why not? We're gonna work in one direction and then we'll work in the opposite direction to get everything into place. I'm gonna pick up my skirt here, picking up both layers, my skirt and my waistband, pinching together. There should be a corresponding notch in your waistband. So feel your way along. If you're going to follow with me, just follow along the left-hand side. You should find another notch. That notch matches your side seam on your skirt. So place that notch at the side seam of your skirt. Notches are placed into patterns to act as registration points for your pattern pieces. We always pin our notches first. Pin your notches first because the notches indicate how you need to distribute your pattern pieces together. So we've pinned the notches at the front, pin that 1 notch at the side seam. I can continue working my way around here, and I should find another notch about a 1/2 inch in from the raw edge of my waistband right here. That last notch lines up with the center of my skirt. So I'm going to line that notch up right along the zipper teeth on my skirt. So I will have a 1/2 inch extension. This is the rest of my seam allowance on my waistband that extends beyond my zipper. So make sure when you place your zipper here, do not place your zipper all the way at the edge of your waistband because then you won't be able to clean finish your waistband. You should have 1/2 inch of extra fabric hanging out from your waistband. This is your seam allowance for your waistband. You're going to need that for later when we sew this waistband together. Okay, so notches are pinned. Got 1/2, remember this is the center of the skirt, the side seam, and the center back with the 1/2 inch extension left over from our waistband. I'll go back to my center. I'm going to work my way around the other side. Again, kind of pinching both layers. There we go. You should find another notch somewhere in the vicinity of your side seam. Make sure your seam allowances stay open unless you've made a French seam or a flat felt seam. But if you've done a turn and stitch or a serge or Hong Kong bias bound, make sure the seams are kept open on your side seam. It helps to reduce bulk. Same thing over here. Seams are kept open, pressed open. So here's my waistband. I'm going to find that notch, place that notch right at that side seam. Should straddle that seam and pin that in place. I'm pinning on either side of the notch because I'm pinning my seam allowance flat. I want to make sure that doesn't fly up as I'm getting ready to sew this. And then I'm going to work my way to the back here. You're going to find a few notches at the back of your waistband. This first notch that's closest to the rest of the garment, this notch corresponds to the center back of your skirt. But you will find that there is far more of an extension left over on your waistband. We need this extra extension. It is included in the pattern for a reason, because when we close our waistband, we finish off this skirt, we need to have some extra fabric so that one side of the waistband can lap over the other, and we can place our hook and eye into this extra extension. So while this side has a 1/2 inch extension, just a seam allowance left over from our waistband, this side I believe has 1.5 inches of extra fabric, 1.5 inches extension. 1 inch is for the added extension to place our hook and eye, and the other 1/2 inch is leftover seam allowance for our waistband. So make sure, again, align this notch. There should be a notch here, and there should be a second notch here to indicate the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure to place this notch closest to the body of the garment and leave this extra 1.5 inches hanging out here. If you're not following this, your waistband is not going to fit your skirt properly, and you're going to have some issues, some troubles with finishing off your skirt. So let me just follow that one more time. Set of 3 notches. There is a missing notch on your skirt. You should have 2 notches 1 inch apart. Just fold them together and find that center point between them and make a notch in between them. So there's 3 notches 1/2 inch apart. That will correspond to the 3 notches on your waistband. Remember, those 3 notches on your waistband only exist on one of these long edges. So it makes sure that our extension shows up on just this side of our skirt. You should find another notch that corresponds to your side seam. Pin that in place. Remember, right sides together. And then another notch at the end here, corresponding to the center back of our skirt, with a 1/2 inch extension left over from our waistband. Back around the other side, there's our center again, center front. Another notch to match up with the side seam on the skirt. And then 1 notch to match with the center back on the skirt, with a 1.5 inch extension left over from our waistband. I'm going to go to the inside of my garment, looking at it with the waist side up. What you may start to see is there's a gap, a little bit of a gap between the waistband and the skirt itself. So we pin our notches first to ensure that we've got pieces positioned properly. But then you may find that these don't quite line up. It looks like the waistband's a little bit bigger than the skirt maybe. What's happening is the curve of the skirt. We know that our skirt edges are curved, and we know that they become more, that curve becomes more and more pronounced when we sew our darts together. It curves our waistband in the front and the back. But our waist, I'm sorry, it curves the waistline of our skirt on the front and the back. But the waistband is just a rectangle. So right now we're trying to fit a curved edge to a straight edge. So we've got the curve of our skirt and the straight raw edge of our waistband. So how do we make this fit? That's another reason we have our stay stitching on our skirt. The stay stitching not only prevents the fabric from stretching out along the bias, preventing it from fraying too far, but it also acts as reinforcement, because in order to make this curve lie straight along my waistband, I have to clip into my seam allowance here. The stay stitching will help prevent any of the clipping I'm about to do from tearing all the way into my garment. It's also going to give me a stopping point for where I need to stop cutting when I go to clip my seam allowance. I'm going to grab a small pair of scissors so this can be hopefully a little easier to see on camera. So I've got a section back here. Here's my long 1.5 inch extension. And I want to look at this from the skirt side, so you can see there's my darts from my skirt that are basted down with my stay stitching. You can see the difference between the curve of my skirt and that straight line of my the raw edge of my waistband. I'm going to I'm using my left hand to support. You should be cutting it on the table or using your hand to support your work. I'm just going to cut through the skirt. Do not cut through your waistband. We don't need to do anything more to the waistband. That's already in place. It's positioned. It's fine. But I'm going to cut through just the skirt fabric, and I'm just going to cut until I reach my stay stitching. So there's my stay stitching right there. I'm going to take my little scissors and I'm just going to clip right into there till I'm about 1/16 of an inch or so away from that stay stitching. And every 3/4 of an inch or so, I'm going to put another clip in my skirt. Put another one here. Again, I'm using my stay stitching as my guide to make sure I don't clip past that. Do not clip through your stay stitching. Keep that intact. Put another clip here. And every 3/4 of an inch or so, clip into it without going through your stay stitching. So now I've got these little clips in just my skirt. Here's my waistband still hanging out here. And you should see when you go to straighten this out that you can kind of tug on this, and those little clips kind of help to spread out the seam allowance. So now what had been curved like this, I can now stretch it out and get it to fit that straight line a little bit better. Remember, do not clip through your stay stitching. Those act as reinforcement. They act as a stopping guide for you so you don't over clip your seam allowance, because if you do, you'll end up with a hole in your garment. Make sure you're only clipping through the skirt and not the waistband. And make sure when you're doing this, you've already got your notches pinned first. Do not move your pins, because if you clip your garment first, then you don't know what's a notch and what isn't a notch and what applies to what. They all look like notches now. So make sure you've pinned, you've utilized the notches on the waistband to help position where the waistband's going to go. Use those registration points. And then we can clip into the skirt and we can be confident knowing that we've got this positioned properly. So align your raw edges, make sure those are flush, and pin that into place. Make sure your raw edges are flush. They shouldn't be offset like this or like this. Make sure they're nice and level with each other. Pin through that. So that takes care of one section. I'm going to take a look at the next one. Here I am at my front. This one is fitting a little bit better, but I'm still going to clip into my skirt fabric just a little bit, just to relieve some tension, so I can get that curve to fit that straight line a little bit better. I'm not clipping quite as close. Every inch or so on here is fine. I'm just going to kind of give it a tug so I can get that curve to come and stretch out to fit that straight edge of my waistband. Pin that in place. Again, keeping my raw edges flush. Okay, move on to the next section. Same thing here. This is my center front to my side seam. I'm going to clip every inch or so just into my skirt fabric, just to relieve a little tension. Still using my hand to support my scissors. You can cut flat on the table, but since I'm trying to film this, I'm trying to keep this up in front of the camera. So again, getting that clipped, I can now kind of spread this seam allowance, and it should fit my waistline a little bit better here, my waistband. Pin that in place. Okay. And I'll get to my center back to my side seam again. More pronounced deviation from one seam allowance to the other. So I'll clip into my skirt again every 3/4 of an inch or so. You don't need to over clip. We don't need a ton of clips, because the more you clip into it, the more we affect the structural integrity of the fabric. We don't want a whole bunch of teeny tiny little chips and chops, because then the fabric starts to fall apart on us. But now I should be able to push that seam allowance out, give it a little bit of a tug so that we can get that seam allowance nice and flush with the waistband. Okay. That's looking pretty good. I'm going to hand baste this in place because I do not want to have to deal with all of these pins while I'm sewing. So now that this is pinned in place, everything, I'm using my notches as my registration points. Those are looking pretty good. I'm going to hand baste this so I can ensure that nothing's going to get out of alignment while I'm sewing. Be careful with your hand basting. I will show you how I go about doing my hand basting. I have to prepare for some thread. I like to wax my thread. It makes it less susceptible to tangling. Now when I go into hand baste this, I'm going to point out a few things that I'm going to do here. When I hand baste my work, assuming this is my raw edge here, and I know that I'm sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance because that's what's indicated on my pattern. I'm going to make a mark here just so you all can see this. Placing the 1/2 inch mark on my raw edge. And if you want to go through and mark your entire stitching line, you can. I'm going to use the seam guide on my machine so I don't have to go through all the time of marking all that. But if I know that I'm sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, there's my purple mark there, 1/2 inch seam allowance. I know that's where I'm going to end up stitching these two pieces together. I tend to place my basting stitches, especially when I'm basting two pieces of fabric together, 1/8 of an inch away from my seam allowance. So anything between my stitching line and the raw edge of my fabric is going to be inside of the seam allowance. So anything inside of here, as I mentioned before, that stay stitching and whatnot, I'm not going to have to remove. This, however, with my hand basting, I want to place it outside of my seam allowance. So I'm going to place it at about 5/8 of an inch from my raw edge, about 1/8 of an inch away outside of my stitching line. And let me explain why I tend to do this. If I know that my fabric is nice and smooth on both sides, as deep as 5/8 of an inch away from my raw edge, if I know that any puckering or anything is taken care of down here outside of the way of my stitching line, I can be very confident when I go to the sewing machine that I'm not going to end up with any puckers or wrinkles or gathers or anything catching in under my needle while I'm sewing. So I tend to push all the excess gunk and whatever else might get in my way of my needle down outside of my seam allowance, down into the garment fabric. And if I can lock down my basting stitches, they act as kind of a barrier for my stitching line when I go to the sewing machine. So anything that might get gathered or puckered or anything strange that might go on with the seam, if I can ensure that my fabric is laying flat on both sides at 5/8 of an inch, then I'm very confident that it will lay nice and flat at 1/2 an inch as well. I want to secure my stitches while I get this in place because I don't want my seam allowance to drop or droop or anything like that. I want to make sure this is nice and secure. So I'm going to take a few reinforcing stitches. There we go. Just loop in the same place about 1 or 2 times. And now I'll go ahead and do my basic basting stitch, running stitch all the way across. I know my stay stitching is at 3/8 of an inch, so I can stitch about 1/4 of an inch away from that and know that my stitching line is going to sit somewhere in between my basting and my stay stitching. Going through the last few bits of my hand basting, you'll see I'm doing a back stitch right here so I can secure the edge of my zipper tape, and I'll do a few more back stitches here to secure the edge of my lap zipper. So I'll just take a few stitches here in the same place, just to make sure that is secure. Clip my thread, leaving a little bit of a tail just so it's easy for me to find it so I can remove those basting stitches. Pins are now removed. Now I can sew comfortably without the pins getting in my way. I've base stitched about 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. So again, those basting stitches will act as a bit of a barrier in case there's any kind of lumps or bumps that want to creep their way up into my stitching line at 1/2 an inch. I'm ready to sew. I'm going to take this to my machine and sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and at the end of my work. So I'll start here. No sense in stitching off on this 1.5 inch extension. It's not connecting to anything. But right where my skirt attaches, I'm going to start right there, back tack on a number 2 stitch, sew all the way across at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then when I get back over here, again, it doesn't make any sense to stitch out here on this waistband extension because it's not attaching to anything, but I will back tack right here at the edge of my zipper. Now your zippers will probably look different unless you've done a lap zipper. But if you've done a centered or invisible zipper, your zipper is going to look a little bit different, but it does not change this 1/2 inch extension that will meet at center back, and again, 1.5 inch extension that meets right here at the center back edge. Again, using my high-tech seam guide, starting right there where the edge of my skirt attaches. Back tack, sewing on a number 2 length stitch, back tack, and then sew all the way across, just making sure. And I'm going to get into the habit, you may see me doing this where I'm kind of scratching at the fabric. I'm pushing any weird lumps or bumps that I might feel underneath. I'm pushing them out of the way. Should be a pretty smooth ride under here because this is interface, so it's not likely to get too mushed up. But get accustomed to feeling your fabric before it gets into your needle, because if there's anything going strange, you'll know, and you can stop before anything terrible happens. And back tacking as I finish off. I get past this zipper. And I may back tack a few times just to make sure that that is locked into place. I'm going to take a quick look underneath. I know my basting stitches are still in the way here, so if I tug on this, you may see a couple of little red threads poking out there. So that's my basting stitches. So I won't really know what's going on at my seam until I take those out. But I'm just going to give it a quick look-see and see if there's anything that looks untoward, any ripples, anything that may have gotten bunched or pinched like this. I want to make sure that is not in my seam work. If for some reason something went wrong or you had a hard time pinning it and you've got some like pieces that are kind of lapped over themselves, caught in that seam, you can just rip out that one little section and re-stitch it. Take out about an inch or so of stitching, rip those out, and then re-stitch it to make sure it's as flat as possible. All right, I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. I'll take my basting stitches out and I'll head over to the iron. All right, my stitching is in. I've taken all my basting stitches out. From the right side, I can open this up. I can see nice clean seam work from my waistband into my skirt. I'm going to press from the inside, the wrong side. I don't want to press from the right side just yet. I'm going to press from the inside. Now, up until now, we've been pressing all of our seam allowances open. But if I do that, I'm going to have an extra seam allowance kind of hanging out here because I'm going to use the rest of my waistband to cover up what else is going on here. So for this, I'm going to press all my seam allowances up towards my waistband. I want to keep these going up towards my waistband so when we finish off this waistband, it'll cover up everything. We won't see any seam allowance or anything going on inside of there. So I'm going to press all of my seam allowances, both seam allowances, up towards my waistband. Starting right here, going to press this up towards the waistband. And again, get into the habit of kind of tugging on your fabric ever so slightly to make sure it's not rippling underneath itself. Work in small sections. Take your time. I recommend placing most of the iron up here on the waistband because it's nice and flat. We don't want to start pressing too many wrinkles or anything down here on our skirt. So I'm just giving it a little tug, hitting it with some steam. And as I get to this other end with my 1.5 inch extension, I just want to press in this general area. I don't have to press all the way to the end yet, so I've kind of left this seam allowance kind of open. I do want to press in this area right here though, where my zipper tape is, but I'm not worried about this just yet. We're going to take a look at what we're going to do to finish off this waistband. I just want to check from the front, make sure I haven't gotten too much of my fabric kind of rippling and buckling underneath itself. And if I need to repress any areas, I will do that. So taking a look from the right side, make sure there's no threads or basting stitches or anything hanging out. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do preemptively, it's going to make my construction a lot easier. Now that I've got my seam allowance pressed up, so we've taken care of this edge that's connected to our skirt. That seam allowance is done. Let's take care of this edge that's going on over here, the top edge of our waistband, the remaining long edge of our waistband. I'm going to fold a 1/2 inch, because I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance built into there. I'm going to fold that onto itself. Again, this is wrong sides up, and I want to fold a 1/2 inch inside of itself. So I'm removing another 1/2 inch from the right side. Don't fold it in this direction. We don't want to put right sides together because we're getting ready to encase everything. We want to fold the wrong sides together on that top edge of the waistband. Use your ruler if need be. Grab a little ruler, and there should be a notch on either side to indicate that 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, I'm pressing wrong sides together. And if you need to, use your ruler to ensure that you're pressing a 1/2 inch under that 1/2 inch. I have a pressing guide. I don't expect you all to have this. This is not required, but it does make these kinds of things easier. This Clover brand pressing guide. So it's marked with imperial measurements, and I can fold my fabric over until it reaches close to that 1/2 inch mark. And then I can be pretty confident that I'm pressing under a 1/2 inch. It's not the most accurate thing in the world, but I find it a little easier and faster to use as opposed to my ruler every time. But you'll get into the habit of just eyeballing 1/2 inch, so you won't really need a ruler after a while. I'm going to fold that under and press that into place. If you find this a little unwieldy, all this fabric bubbling up, you can grab a sleeve board. There should be sleeve boards in all of the classrooms. And you can place the sleeve board on here, onto your ironing board, and kind of elevate your work up top here, if it helps you to get into smaller sections as you go around and get some of that excess out of the way. The sleeve board has many, many uses. Just be patient, because good pressing is pivotal to good garment construction. And yet again, as I get over to this 1.5 inch extension on this side of my waistband, I'm not too worried about getting this 1/2 inch folded down. We're going to take care of finishing that edge off in just a moment. I just want to press down most of this edge, but I'm not too worried with getting a sharp crease on this end here. I just want to get from like this edge over. And I'm just going to go over this one more time, make sure it's pressed in there nice and crisp, because this will make my life much easier when I get ready to finish off my waistband. Sewing a garment is about 10% of the time you actually spend making a garment will be actually sewing it together. You spend more time pressing, cutting, preparing fabric, and finishing, because we're going to be doing all hand-finished, hand-sewn finishes for this garment. Okay, my top edge, my opposing edge, the one that isn't sewn to my skirt, now has 1/2 inch folded under, wrong sides together, so that's in place. Now let's take a look at how we're going to finish off these two ends of our skirt. So to finish off these two raw edges on our waistband, we're going to need a few things. Make sure you have a clear ruler handy, some kind of marking tool, chalk, or friction pen or something like that. And we're going to take this one step at a time, because finishing these will be different. I'm going to start with this end first that has that 1/2 inch extension. So I'm going to start with this side for the first that has that 1/2 inch extension. I tuck everything out of the way so you can clearly see what I'm doing here. I'm going to take this. I've got my garment right sides up. Remember, I've got this folded under here. There should be a notch in the shorter edge of your fabric of your waistband. So there should be a notch right about there. This indicates the fold line on your waistband. So I want to fold this waistband right sides together with that notch right at the fold. And lining up my raw edges here, you're going to see that this stitched seam lays pretty close to the folded edge that we just made. So we're just folding this in half, keeping these folds pretty close to one another and keeping these edges flush. Okay, I'm going to make a little mark for myself. I actually turn this over so I can see my zipper. And I'm just going to give myself a vertical line. It may not be exactly a 1/2 inch, but I want to indicate where I should sew just beside my zipper. It's not quite exactly a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but I'm using the edge of my zipper as my guide to indicate where I need to be stitching. We're going to end up stitching through the entire waistband, folded waistband. So I'm going to pin this in place, going through all of my layers, all the folded edges. You should have a folded edge under here on your waistband, as well as this folded edge here that's attached to your skirt. And I'm going to end up changing my feet so that I can get really, really close to that edge. And we're going to sew through the entire thing. So we'll go to the machine eventually, but let's get the other extension of our waistband taken care of so we can sew everything all at once. That takes care of the end with the 1/2 inch extension. Let's take a look at this side that has the 1.5 inch extension. This one's a little bit different. It's similar, but not the same. So again, I've got the right side of my waistband. I'm going to look for that notch on the side there. Should be a little notch right in the short edge. And again, I'm going to fold along that notch, right sides together. So that notch is sitting right there on the fold. I'm going to fold along that notch, right sides together. Instead of keeping these edges folded up, I'm instead going to push these edges down. It's going to cause my seam allowances from my skirt to kind of go down a little bit. That's okay for what we're getting ready to do. So I'm going to push all the seam allowances down towards the skirt, lay this seam allowance down, make sure I'm folding right along that folded edge. And what I want to do is indicate my stitching line. I know I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance along here, so I'm going to draw that in. 1/2 inch away from my raw edge, give myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I know I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance along this edge, so I'm going to mark that as well. 1/2 inch away from the raw edge. So I now have this little corner from my folded edge right here, down 1/2 inch away from the raw edge, pivoting in this corner and going in towards where my skirt is attached. I'm going to sew this corner, and I'm going to stop right here where I can see the edge of my skirt. And when you go to mark this, you will feel a little bit of resistance as you get to this point where this seam attaches. So we don't have to go all the way across here. We're not going to go all the way into the skirt here. We can stop even 1/8 of an inch or so away from there. But I want to sew this corner, stopping right about here where the edge of my zipper attaches in my center back. So I'm going to start at the fold, back tacking at the fold, pivot in the corner, and stop right here, back tacking again. But remember to keep all of your seam allowances flat on both sides. We don't want anything tucking up or folding up out of the way. And I'm going to pin this in place as well, keeping my raw edges flush along here and along this bottom edge here. So remember, all your seam allowance is going to start pushing down towards the skirt. We just got to take care of this corner and this little edge here. I'm going to start with sewing this edge, the edge with the 1/2 inch extension. And I'm going to need one of my finishing feet to do this because I want to get as close as I can to this zipper tape without going over it. So let's take a look. If I use this foot, all right, that's not going to get me very close. It's going to be, I'm going to be stitching too far to the right. But this one should get me right up against where I need to be. That's going to get me really, really close. So I'm going to switch out my feet. Okay, making sure everything is folded into place, pinned properly, starting at the folded edge. Going to back tack at this folded edge. Just making sure my folds are matching up. Back tack at this folded edge, number 2 stitch. And going right up against that zipper. Just going to remove my pins as I go. Do not want to sew over the pins. I don't necessarily want to catch the zipper tape, but I should be stitching right next to it. So there's my needle, there's my zipper tape. I'm going to walk my last few stitches and back tack at this other end. There's my stitching right along that edge, so it comes really close to where my zipper tape is. While I am here, I'm going to grab my awl, and I'm going to grab a pair of scissors, because I'm going to want to turn this corner right side out. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to clean up some of this extra bulk. So remember, just make sure you're stitching through all the layers. You're stitching all the way to the end here. We don't want these seam allowances to be loose or anything. We need it stitched all the way across. And I'm going to clip away about half of my seam allowance till I have about 1/8 of an inch, kind of hefty 1/8 of an inch seam allowance here. And right here at my corner, I'm going to clip a little bit of that corner away. I don't want to get too close to my stitching. I want to make sure I still have about, I have a little bit, almost 1/8 of an inch. This is kind of a hefty 1/8, almost 1/4 inch of seam allowance, and about 1/8 of an inch of seam allowance at the corner there. This is called clipping your corners. It's going to help us reduce bulk. And now I can place my finger in here, just looping that inside. Place my thumb at the corner and push this corner out. Let me show you that one more time. There's my finger. Pinching with my thumb. I'm going to push this out with my thumb. Now my thumb is inside. You can see it makes a nice clean finish to our corner here. Now my corner is a little bit soft there. I can crisp that out a little bit. This is where an awl or the end of a pair of scissors or a seam ripper can help. I'm going to place the awl inside of there, close to this point. Please be careful doing this. Don't push too hard or you can end up pushing a hole into your garment. And I'm literally in here with the awl just pushing up on this corner. Pushing that seam allowance up and out to give me as crisp of a corner as I can. I should almost see my stitches right along here. So that's looking pretty good. It's giving me a nice clean finish on both sides. So I'm happy with that. Let's go to the other side, that 1.5 inch extension side, and see how we finish that off. Here's my other side here. Keep my skirt flat. Remember to keep seam allowances going down towards the skirt for right now. Start up at this corner here. You can switch feet. I'm just going to keep the same foot on here. I'm just going to use my stitching line to help guide me as I sew, making sure seam allowances are flush along this side and along the bottom here. starting at the fold, back tacking at the fold, going down this edge, getting to this point. As I reach this little point here, I'm going to walk my stitch until I'm right in that corner. Make sure my needle is down, lift my presser foot, pivot my work, and continue stitching across, getting as far as I can. I want to make sure all my seam allowance is still going down and out of the way. So I'm checking under here to make sure that seam allowance is still laying in the same direction. And I'll go around that corner, walk my way till I get to my little mark or close to it. And now I can back tack. All right. Okay. Here's my corner sewn. Started here, down to here, pivoted, went over here. Just want to make sure I can still get my seam allowance. I can still access my seam allowance. There's still a little bit of wiggle room in there because I'm going to want to be able to get this seam allowance pushed back up. So make sure as you stitch over here, just check along the side, this seam that attaches to your skirt. Make sure you can still push that up and nothing has gotten caught. I'm going to do the same thing, something similar that I did to the other side. I'm going to trim away my seam allowance to about half, so about a 1/4 inch seam allowance up around this edge. I'll also trim this seam allowance down here just a little bit, kind of taper it into my 1/2 inch there. So you can see I trimmed most of it here around the corner and then tapered it back to that original 1/2 inch there. And just as we did before, I've got a corner here, so I'm going to clip that corner, again keeping about 1/8 of an inch of seam allowance before I actually get to the stitching. And I'm going to do the same down here. I'm going to clip this corner at a 45-degree angle, again keeping about 1/8 of an inch between that corner where I stitched and the rest of that seam allowance. And if we want to, we can taper this corner even more, and I'm clipping through all the layers. Again, this is the clipping your corners helps reduce bulk, just like clipping your curves helps to reduce bulk or to turn your work right side out. Clipping curves can help reduce bulk. It can also help with fitting curves to straight edges. So now we've got kind of a interior corner here. It's going to be a little bit harder to push this out, but we can do it. Again, I'm going to reach inside. I'm going to kind of push. I've got one finger here. I'm going to push this corner out. Push this out. Right side out. And again, I'm going to grab my awl. I'm going to do my best to poke out as many of these corners as I can. Take your time. We're going to end up with a corner here and a corner up here, so it's going to end up looking like this. Do my best to poke these out. Get my awl in there. Try to push that seam allowance up and out. Just again, be careful, don't push too hard. You can use the tip of a pencil, just retract any pencil lead you might have. If you're using a mechanical pencil, you can do that. Try my best to get these into nice sharp corners. And keep pushing. I'm going to use the end of my screwdriver, because why not? I think that will get me a corner a little bit better. Okay. kind of using the tip of my awl to carefully get in there and kind of push those corners out. So be very careful doing that. You wouldn't want to do that on delicate fabrics because you'll definitely rip a hole into it, but these woven fabrics, especially with interfacing, should be fine. And there is our extended corner. Here's the rest of my skirt hanging out here. There's my extension with those two corners. From the inside, here's my zipper. Again, here is the seam that I sewed onto my skirt, and here's that pressed edge. So it's already pressed under, it's already ready to go to cover up all of that nasty seam allowance, give us a nice clean finish on the inside of our skirt. So now it's a case of finishing. I'll go to the work table to pin this in place. So let's take a look at what we've gathered so far, what we have done here. Here's our flush edge that had our 1/2 inch extension. Here is our extended edge with that 1.5 inch extension. And as I mentioned, at the sewing machine, we now have a nice clean finish on the inside. This is already pressed, so it can cleanly, you know, all that seam allowance is going up into the waistband. We can cover that up. We can even cover that stitching that's there. And I'm going to pin that in place. Same thing over here. This is already pressed, so it's ready to cover up our zipper tape. We can even cover a little bit of the stitching that's there. We can pin that. Now there are corresponding notches along the inner edge, this long edge of your waistband. So this notch right here, as you can see, here's my center back over here. This corresponds to my side seam. So I know this area right here should fold down right over my side seam. So I can kind of line that up, and again covering up some of my stitching, my original stitching that was right here. Pin that. Same thing here. There's that other notch that corresponds to my side seam. Now there should be one more notch around the center front here. Maybe not, I don't see one. But we're going to work our way, again taking this folded edge and covering up just, it should line up just along, if not slightly over, our original line of stitching where we stitched our skirt into place. But you can see if I just give that a tug, it kind of lays nice and flat all by itself. And we can just pin that in place, making sure it's not descending too low. We don't want the folded edge to come way, way down here. It should be right on top of that original line of stitching where we sewed our skirt to our waistband. And again, once this is pinned in place, you can then hand baste it in place if you'd like. I usually keep my pins in and go ahead and slip stitch my waistband into place. We will be using a slip stitch, an uneven slip stitch to finish this because you already have a nice, so if it makes more sense to turn it this way so it looks like our hem finish. We've already got a nice folded edge, and we can just pick up tiny little stitches in our skirt garment right here and then travel through that little folded edge as we go from one end all the way around to the other. Kind of work my way across, again making sure that folded edge just barely covers that stitching. And you can always check this. This is a 1 inch tall waistband, so you can check to see that it's about 1 inch from one folded edge to where you place your fold. So if you fold it too far, if you don't fold it far enough, you're going to see your stitching in there. If you don't fold it far enough, you're going to see your stitching, and you won't have a 1 inch tall waistband. If you fold it too far, you're going to end up with a big old thick 1.25 inch waistband on the inside, and then it's going to look kind of funky. So you can use your ruler to make sure you're pinning and that you're folding about a 1 inch tall waistband. So it should be 1 inch from one fold to the next. And then once this is pinned, we'll slip stitch this in place, and then we'll work on adding the hook and eye. Because as you can see from our center back, once I zip up my zipper, now I've got these two ends of my waistband just kind of flopping around. So this is where my hook and eye is going to finish off my waistband. So we'll install a hook and eye to these two pieces. But we've got to get the waistband into place first, so I'm going to slip stitch that into place. While you're in a hand stitching kind of mode, you can also finish off your hem. I've just preemptively started turning my hem allowance as I was finishing off my slit at the center back. But you do have notches placed at 1.25 inches above the raw cut edge. So utilize those. There's a little bitty notch right in there, and another one here. So those are at 1.25 inches from your raw edge. Use those as a guideline. You'll just fold right at those notches, so you'll be folding up 1.25 inches, and you choose what kind of hem finish you want. We've learned 4 different hem finishes. You can remove this and serge along the entire bottom edge, making sure your seam allowances stay open as you serge over them. And serge and serge and serge and serge. Make sure those are open, and you just serge to the other end. If you're doing a blind catch or a flat catch stitch, or you can start from one end, turn under your 1/4 inch, press that 1/4 inch, wrong sides together, all the way to the opposite side, and then press again that remaining inch, making sure it's nice and flat and flush. We shouldn't see the hem finish. We shouldn't see the hem of the skirt. Let me see. Should be a nice flat edge all the way across. I shouldn't see the hem of the skirt going down here and, you know, curly Q designs and curved and whatnot. It's not drafted for a curved hem. It's drafted for a straight finished hem. So I think I will serge mine and do either a flat catch or a blind catch stitch. Maybe I'll do a slip stitch. I think I'll do a slip stitch this time. So I may press mine a few times so I have it ready for a slip stitch, just so we can have a little bit of difference. I think my first skirt from fall quarter had a flat catch, so I think I may do a serge uneven slip stitch. And then we will install the hook and eye.